Les doy la bienvenida a todos ustedes, miembros de nuestra querida organización NEA, que fielmente, pues cada miércoles lleva a cabo este evento, la hora NEA, con una intención de compartir el conocimiento y compartir la amistad que tenemos con gente que de verdad tiene posiciones y conocimiento eminente. Quiero agradecer también a la gente que participa de la organización FENG, Organización de Financieros, el Club 51, de Noricumbo and Partners, de la revista Mundo Ejecutivo, con quien tenemos también un convenio de participación, y por supuesto con los miembros del COMSE que hoy nos acompañan. Sean todos bienvenidos. Como es nuestra costumbre, les pido a todos que apaguen sus micrófonos, que deshabiliten sus cámaras, y vamos a quedar en escena solamente Chris MAYO y su servidor. Esta tarde será una tarde de practicar nuestro inglés británico, así que agudicen vuestros oídos y también invitarles a que anoten sus preguntas, sus comentarios en el chat, porque les garantizo que será tremendamente enriquecedor. Nos dará una idea de oportunidades que en medio de esta situación y de esta incertidumbre en la que anda el mundo, pues nos convence de saber que todavía hay oportunidades de inversión en varias partes de este planeta. And now, let me switch into my own British style sort of English, which is not really British, but I'm close. Thank you, Chris MAYO, for being here. And I will share again your resume to our audience, stating that you're still head of primary markets, America's London Stock Exchange Group, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Perfect. No additional responsibilities so far?
Not yet. We'll see. We'll see.
Okay. And you're based...
Maybe president. No one wants to win that one.
Who knows? Who knows? So just be ready. Chris helps companies and investment managers from the Americas to access capital through corporate equity, debt, and fund listings on London's public markets. He has more than 20 years of corporate finance experience in New York and in London for institutions like Barclays, Salomon Smith Barney, Citi, Schroders, and he has executed IPOs, financings, and mergers and acquisitions transactions in the US and Europe worth tens of billions of dollars. Chris was a primary markets specialist for the London Stock Exchange on the technology and life science sectors, and was also an investor and head of a strategy for an early cloud managed services company, which exited to a UK technology company. Do you know how this company is doing, Chris?
It's actually doing okay. So the company that bought the company that I invested in has done quite well. So it's not super large, but you know it's an IT systems integrator. It's probably $50 to $100 million of revenue these days. I mean it's doing pretty well. Okay. It does stuff in the UK, Europe, and the United States. So it's a decent size business now.
And you have some stock of this company?
No, I was an earnout, so I got the earnout. So yeah, I'm okay.
Oh yeah.
So, it didn't make me a millionaire. It didn't make me a millionaire, but I did make some money. So.
Well, who knows? Well, Chris holds a first-class honors bachelor degree in international business in German from Aston University. He also has a master's degree in international relations from Columbia University. And he also is a certified chartered financial analyst. Some of you, audience, may recall Chris' presentation on London as a partner in the international capital markets we had in early September this year, stating the challenges and opportunities of making intelligent investment in the UK. But also he gave us a clear understanding of sectors and businesses which are of interest at this time in the area he covers. Today, Chris will focus his presentation on the so-called ESG investment, which is also called responsible funding because the environmental, social, and governance areas that are related to this definition of funding. So this is the theme for today. And with this, I introduce you, Chris MAYO, and the mic is yours. Let me say that we have your presentation, and then after, our good friend Armando Nuricumbo will hold the Q&A session. And I can also be there too. So thank you, Chris, for being here, and we welcome you. Please.
Yeah, thank you for the kind introduction, Jesus, and thank you to Rodrigo. And I would say to Rodrigo, please get well soon. It's good to hear that you are feeling a lot better than you were yesterday and the day before. So, you know, we obviously wish you the best. So I just thank you for the invitation. The topic of ESG is very current, and actually the London Stock Exchange has a lot of involvement in this in very many areas. So what I'll talk about today will be a number of things. I'll talk about what we're doing to help companies listed on any stock exchange, so not just London, to harmonize their disclosure to attract investors. And we do this through a company we own called FTSE Russell. You may have heard of the Russell 2000 index. That's that's our product, and hopefully you can see my screen here. I'm trying to put this onto. Yes, you can see my screen. So I'm going to go through a presentation. So we own FTSE Russell, which provides products which help corporates and investors track the ESG factors and revenues and costs within their business. We also do a lot of things with regards to sustainable debt, and we also do a lot of things with regards to helping issuers on the London Stock Exchange specifically highlight their green credentials. And I'll talk about all of that stuff today. And I'm also going to try and do something a bit interactive. I'm not sure where I may be able to kind of skip from this, hopefully from this presentation, into a web page when I'll show you some stuff that we've just come out with. So let me just, okay, that seems to be working. Okay, that's good. London Stock Exchange Group is not just about the exchange. It's about all of the composite businesses that make up the London Stock Exchange Group. And in fact, I'm going to talk a lot about those other businesses today. So I'm not just going to talk about, the fact that we list companies on the exchange. I'm going to talk about FTSE Russell and what they do to help companies and investors track ESG factors. I'm going to talk about our debt platform, which is something that people don't often hear about. And actually, that's really relevant to Mexico because we've just done something with the Mexican government with regards to that. I think people will find interesting on this call. And I'll talk a little about some of our other businesses as well that help, track ESG in more detail. But I just wanted to make people understand LSE Group is a really broad-based business, and we're in the kind of latter stages of acquiring a business called Refinitiv, which used to be part of Thomson Reuters. And with that, the North America will be by far our biggest revenue market. So even though we're the London Stock Exchange, will actually be quite a US-centric business, and we actually have a US CEO, as it happens. So we truly are a global business when it comes to market infrastructure. When it comes to sustainability, we are trying to integrate our businesses to provide a suite of products with regards to information, but also capital raising, which can help issuers and also investors access sustainable investments. And we think that we are a leader, a world leader in this. And I'm happy to say that third parties think that the London Stock Exchange Group is a leader in this. We were awarded in June as the Sustainable Stock Exchange of the Year by Environmental Finance magazine, and this was through a couple of things I'll talk about today, which are the launch of the Green Economy Mark, which is something for listed equities, and also the launch of the Sustainable Bond Market, which is obviously about debt. But what we're really trying to do is highlight companies that are more active in the green kind of sustainable arena, and we're also trying to enable the transition to more sustainable, low carbon economies. And it's, by the way, I would say it's not just about environment, it is about the social and governance aspects. So I won't just be focusing on green today, I'll be talking about all of these things. As I said, we are, there's lots of aspects to our business. And as you can see on the right there are lots of different parts of the business which have relevance from LSEG for ESG. So it's not just about the London Stock Exchange, it's about all the different parts of the group. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to do things like encourage investment flows into sustainable finance. We want to provide products which help you track those flows. And we also want to standardize the information that companies provide so that an investor can compare across companies and understand the sustainability of their particular investment case. And obviously, convene the market. We want to provide a place where people can both raise capital and trade instruments as well. We have a lot of different products which cover the ESG kind of arena. We have more than 100 ESG focused indices. It could be things about carbon emissions. It could be things about the green economy or green real estate. We have a lot of bonds which are listed on the market, which are green or sustainable. Can be renewables, water, infrastructure, sustainable development. I'll talk about some specific instances from Latin America later in the presentation. And we have a number of ETFs, as you would expect as well. And we also have 22 green funds. Now, these are closed-end investment funds that are listed on the London Stock Exchange. They're essentially tradable equities. And they're in areas like wind or in waste management. And these are things that investors can invest in directly and then trade to get exposure to ESG factors. And then we also have companies which have the Green Economy Mark, which is for companies with more than 50% or more of their revenues from what we deem to be green sources. But why is ESG becoming more important? I think we need to take a step back and say, who cares? So I'm going to tell you why people care, why this is a much bigger topic than it was, say, 5 years ago. And so, as you can see, this is basically a survey. And by the way, I'll send these slides to Rodrigo and Jesus after the presentation, so they can circulate to the group. So what we can see here is that 5 years ago, ESG was part of the decision making sometimes, whereas right now it is the vast majority of the time there will be some ESG decision making going on when an investor is making investment. And that is only increasing, is what I would say. And I think that a lot of investors are thinking about it from a kind of risk management point of view, but I think they're also getting pressure from external forces increasingly that they need to be able to show that they are tracking these various factors when making investments. and it's becoming even more important. So this is kind of the for ESG asset classes, globally, what you can see is that there has been a big increase in the last couple of years in terms of assets under management and this is for ESG specific funds. But what I will also say that's important is that even when you're running just a regular fund, which may have a UK mandate, it may have a global emerging markets mandate, even those kind of portfolio managers are increasingly looking at ESG factors and integrating that into their decision making. So I think it's important to understand that this is about ESG specific funds, but when it comes to ESG influencing decision making, that's really happening across the board for all kinds of funds, not just those which are ESG specific. In the UK, this is becoming much more important. So responsible investments, as which is another name for ESG, as Jesus pointed out, that is becoming much more important. And what we will see is that during the COVID crisis, and I think we have this on the next page, I think over the last year, basically when we talk about responsible investments, there have been inflows pretty much every single month up until this summer, whereas the inflows and outflows from equity funds for the UK from retail perspective has been pretty volatile, not so for responsible investments. So this is something which is kind of going past the trend. It's not something that is as volatile as the exposure to equities. It's something that has a gradually increasing profile, is becoming more important in terms of the weight of money which is being devoted to this particular asset class. And it's really reaching down to the very kind of lowest levels. So this was a survey that was done by a UK investment bank called FinCap, which is focused on small cap managers. And what they basically see is you see that inflection again. So even for the smallest equities that are listed, we are seeing that that ESG is important even for the smallest equities, is really what we're seeing. So 70% of the fund managers are taking into account ESG even when they're investing in smaller micro caps, whereas it used to be a lot smaller number than that 5 years ago. So really the takeaway for issuers or corporates is you need to be thinking about how you disclose to the market from an ESG perspective. And these are the areas where they're having discussions. And what I would say about this is that a lot of people focus on environmental when they are talking about ESG. And I think the early genesis of ESG was about kind of negative screens. So it would be an index minus fossil fuels, minus coal, minus oil and gas, that kind of thing. Whereas I think it's become a lot more sophisticated than that now, than that, where you can just look into a regular index and be able to pick out all of the different factors in a very granular fashion to understand what different exposures a particular company has. And that may be, carbon exposure. It could be social. So for instance, it could be, what are their labor relations like? What kind of, are they paying their employees minimum wage? Do they have good labor relations? Now, governance has gone beyond just having an experienced board. It's going to things like diversity of that board and diversity of senior management. So this has become a lot more detailed than it ever used to be. And as you'll see in a subsequent section, we are helping to get into that granular detail as a company. And so this has now become something that is a key focus for pretty much all fund managers when they're talking to corporates that they may invest in. So what are we doing about this? Well, as I said, we own FTSE Russell, so the Russell 2000, which is the big small cap index in the United States, is a London Stock Exchange product, but FTSE Russell create indices and information products for the entire world. And so they break down the kind of individual components of environmental, social, and governance into sub indicators. So there are more than 300 indicators they look at from an operational, financial point of view, and they group those into themes. You may have things like water security, customer responsibility, labor standards, as I've just talked about, and then 3 pillars, which are ESG, and then you basically come up with one rating, which is a rating out of 100% for each, and that allows for comparability across. And again, I'm not talking about companies listed in London. I'm talking about companies listed everywhere. They do this for thousands of companies. I think the last look is that they had ESG data on something like 14,000 companies across the world. So this is really comprehensive data, allowing investors to compare across different markets. We've produced a guide to reporting, and basically this is to help issuers understand what they should be doing in terms of best practices to be able to communicate in the best way with investors about what they're doing from an ESG perspective. And we've got various kind of subsectors we talk about here. I don't know if actually we can I'm trying to think if I can actually change the view of my screen. Maybe I can. Hopefully you'll be able to see. We've actually come up, I don't know if you can see it. Yes, you can see this. This is good. Okay. So this week we actually came up with I'm just sorting on my screen, with a new report. And again, I will post a link to this, which I'll give to Rodrigo and Jesus, about basically the trends in disclosure between investors and issuers with regards to ESG. So this is a report that we produced last week. I won't go through this in detail, but I just wanted to let you know that we've, literally this is how current our thinking is in this. And we basically provided, sector by sector kind of trends in terms of how companies are doing from an ESG disclosure perspective. So I won't go through that in detail, but let me see what else I can do here. I can get back to the original page. Let's see. Okay. The other thing I wanted to show you guys, sorry, it's a bit fiddly, is this thing here. So again, I'll share the link. So this is how, this is actually on the LSE website. So you can actually, there's a tool on our website, and I'll share the link with Jesus and with Rodrigo. You can go into this, and you can, as a company, you can go in and calculate your individual score. So what you do is you pick your industry as a company, say it's consumer goods, then you go start assessment, and it will ask you various questions. So carbon emissions, and then you do yes, no. If you need more information, you can basically do this, and there's various different energy use. There's various different areas of ESG. I'll ask you various questions which are tailored on the basis of the industry that you're in, and then at the end it will generate you a score, and then you can compare that score to the things that I just saw you in this report. So I will share this link with you guys. I think it's actually a really cool tool. It helps probably companies understand where the gaps are in their disclosure from an ESG perspective. So I'll share that link with Jesus and Rodrigo after this. But that was just to give you a flavor of how we're doing things. This week we are basically releasing new tools and reports with regards to helping corporates become more professional in a way with regards to how they report about ESG. So Something that we spend a lot of time on with regards to London listed issuers is that we want to highlight those which are doing things with regards to the low carbon economy. And this is across our main markets, which are the premium main market, AIM, and also the specialist fund segment where we have a lot of closed-end investment funds. And what we've done is we've shined a light on companies which have more than 50% of their revenues, which are generated from green business activities. And how we do that is we actually look at the FTSE Russell Green Revenue Data Model, and these are the various kind of subsectors or subcategories which we analyze to try and understand if a particular company has more than 50% of its revenues with exposure to the green economy. So these are just some kind of sample things here, because it's incredibly granular kind of analysis that we go through. And what we then come up with is something called the green economy mark. And this at the moment is just for London listed issuers, but I suspect that FTSE Russell may expand this to issuers more broadly. We now have 86 equity issuers which have the green economy mark listed in London, which have a combined market cap of $86 billion. They outperform, and I think this is an important thing for investors to understand, is that typically the performance for companies which have exposure, good ESG scores tends to be better. I think there may be a virtuous kind of circle here, which is investors want to seek out companies where they think they have good ESG scores, and therefore that drives out performance. And also, I think there's a scarcity value to those companies as well. And so that has led to good performance by these kind of companies. And as you can see, we have 23 funds, 63 corporates, and there's an even split between the London main market and our growth market AIM. So this is a really cool, and this chart just actually shows, we've seen a big divergence recently in the performance of GEMS, means green economy mark issuers. And so that really does show you how things have outperformed for those sectors. From a sector perspective, the green economy mark is quite widespread. So the biggest sector is industrials in terms of the number of issuers and also the market cap, but there really are a number of different sectors where companies have more than 50% of their revenue from green sources. Recent things, we reviewed this in June of 2020, and we added 8 new issuers to the list. They can be in environmental technologies, green finance, or just green business, things like low carbon transport in the case of, say, National Express. Capital raising has been very robust for this subsector. So it's the 5th largest group for capital raisings in the year to July 2020. So there is a lot of capital that's going into this sector. So it's growing as a part, think of its share of the total market. Its total share of the market is growing quite significantly. So you can see it's only 2% of the total market capitalization of London's equity market, but it's 8% of the total equity raised in the last 24 months. So it is punching above its weight. And what we're trying to do with this is we're just trying to shine a light on the companies which are, most carbon friendly and supporting the transition to the low carbon economy. So that was the equity piece, and I've talked about disclosure already, which is FTSE Russell's products which apply to every market in the world. So even Mexico, Brazil, US, South Africa, FTSE Russell covers all of those different markets. Then I talked about specifically what we're doing at LSE for the London listed equities to help them stand out as being environmentally friendly investments. But now I want to talk about debt, which is an area where, if you remember at the start, I said that we'd won Sustainable Stock Exchange of the Year from Environmental Finance magazine. This is one of the things that was highlighted as the reason why we won that award. We introduced the sustainable bond market to encourage, best practice in disclosure and transparency when it comes to sustainable bond issuances. And there's some things here that are really relevant for Latin America, which I'll talk about. So the sustainable bond market has become a very important market for us. More than £50 billion raised in a variety of currencies. We've even had things that have been issued in Mexican pesos, incidentally. I think that's important to understand. And it's not just about green. There are a lot of green issuances, clearly, but there have been a lot which have been classed as sustainable, which is a much broader definition than just green, or social, as an example. So social, for instance, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, could be COVID recovery. So social projects to help with COVID recovery would definitely fit under this umbrella. And we've actually seen some specific issuances in that area in 2020 that I'll talk about a little bit later. We're also part of the Sustainable Bond Market Advisory Group. And this is really just to, try and create standards across the sustainable bond market so that people can really track what sustainable bonds should be and how that market should evolve. So we're doing that with investors, with government institutions, with supranational institutions and advisors to try and create the most robust sustainable bond market. We launched our own sustainable bond market, and that, as you'll see later, is something that has various different subsectors to it. But what it also does include is mandatory post-issuance reporting. So if you're an issuer and you list a bond on the sustainable bond market, you need to continue to be listed in that segment. You need to be able to be reporting on your sustainability criteria on a consistent basis annually to be able to stay on that market. And so this maybe is a little bit hard to see, but there are various elements of the sustainable bond market. So there is a part of it which is an issuer level classification. This is where an issuer says we are doing something that's sustainable, and that can be sustainability linked bonds. It can be green revenue bonds, which are more than 90% of the revenue from a particular project being to green revenues. That's on the left-hand side of the slide. But then there are also a part of the market which is certified use of proceeds. Now, what this means is that the issuer goes to a third party, and that third party gives an opinion and says, this is a green or sustainable or a social bond, because they actually decide to identify the specific projects where the bonds are going to and let a third party vet that is indeed the case. So there are two, if you like, legs to this market. One where it's an issuer, the issuer says, I'm doing something green or sustainable, or a third party says, yes, you were doing something that was green or sustainable. Again, this is really talking about all the things we're doing from a markets perspective to be part of developing principles around the sustainable capital market initiatives. What I would also say is clearly, we're listing a lot of bonds in the London Stock Exchange. The reason why we do it, and I always have to say this when I'm talking to an audience in, say, Central or South America, is that London is actually relatively cheap for this kind of thing. So London does not have annual fees to list bonds. There is just a one-off vetting fee. And that usually means that we are cheaper than our competitors. And the competitors actually for bonds are not New York or Toronto or somewhere like that. Usually it's London, Luxembourg, and Dublin, and sometimes Singapore are the four biggest markets for bond listings, which I think is surprising to a lot of people. So this is, for instance, when I say there is no annual fee for listing a bond in London, there are annual fees for listing a bond in Luxembourg, and that's where we've been seeking to differentiate ourselves. And these are some of the examples, actually. So if you look at a sample bond and you look across those four markets, London, Ireland, Luxembourg, and Singapore, London will come out cheaper for a 20-year bond, as an example. And usually I would say for a 10-year bond, it would tend to become out cheaper as well. And this is what we're trying to get across to potential issuers. I think one of the other reasons why you would list a bond in London is the visibility of doing so. If it's as easy and it's cheaper to list a bond in London than it is in Luxembourg, then I think you would agree that London has more visibility from a PR perspective, certainly in the issuer's perspective as well. And that's why we think companies from Latin America should be choosing London for their bond issuances. So let me go through some interesting case studies with regards to sustainable bonds. So we have a predominantly Mexican audience today. So I just wanted to let you know that about 6 weeks ago, the Mexican sovereign issued a bond that was listed in London. So this was a 750 million euro sustainable bond for various sustainable financing programs that the Mexican state has. And they listed this bond on what's called ISM, which is our MTF for bond listings in London. The bond was 6.4 times oversubscribed, and it was the second lowest of all euro-denominated bonds in terms of coupon issued by the Mexico federal government. And what I would say is that we usually see that for sustainable bonds versus straight bonds, that there is a slight pricing improvement or yield benefit to doing a sustainable bond versus doing a regular bond. And this is really just because of the scarcity value of the sustainable bond. There is a lot of money that's looking for sustainable investments, and there really isn't enough supply as yet from that market. And that's why you typically see better pricing for these bonds than you do for regular bonds. The first green sovereign bond to ever happen was by Chile, the Republic of Chile, and that was also listed in London. And so they've got, since they did the first listing in 2019, they've since come back in January 2020 and done bonds denominated in euro and dollar, raising 1.3 billion euros and $750 million. And these are to meet the Republic of Chile's national policy goals on climate change and environment, and they're both listed on the sustainable bond market. And so, this just really shows our strength when it comes to Latin American sovereigns, when it comes to listing sustainable bonds in London. But it's not just sovereigns. For instance, just 2 weeks ago, we had the first US municipal green bond to list on the London Stock Exchange. And this was the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, which issued a $300 million bond and listed that on ISM, which is our MTF again. And this is for the Utilities Commission, which is focused on drinking water and wastewater services for the San Francisco area. And they did this to broaden the investor base that they could access, because obviously most uni bonds are listed in the US. By doing this, they wanted to create a global market for their green bonds, and we've hoped that we've helped them to achieve that, and we will see more municipal bonds from the US come to list in London. So going towards a corporate issuer, so Antofagasta is listed in LSE. It's actually a company from Chile as well. It's one of the biggest copper producers in the world. And they just issued their inaugural bond, $500 million. That was also listed on London Stock Exchange, and with a coupon of 2.4% and maturity of 10 years. So it really just shows you that we are, leading in terms of what we're getting from Latin America in terms of debt issuance. I think finally, CAF, which is the Development Bank for Latin America, they are a regular issuer in London, so it's typical for them to list their bonds in London. What I would say from their perspective is that this was a very interesting thing. This was a social bond that they raised in May, specifically for COVID-19 mitigation efforts. So this is for social programs to help with recovery from COVID. And this bond was listed in London in May with 700 million euros. So again, it shows you the wide breadth of sustainable bond issuance, social bond issuance that we're seeing in London right now. And I think that is it. Yes, that's it. So if I can stop sharing my screen, probably I can.
Wow, this is really interesting. I'm very positive surprised just to know why this is the so-called responsible funding. There is a lot behind that. I will pass for Q&A to Armando Noricumbo, but since Miles is here, and I know that he wants to make a comment or ask you a question, we will allow him to use the mic for up to 3 minutes.
It won't take me 3 minutes, Jesus. Chris,
Okay.
I have a probably in the current political and environmental environment, probably the most difficult question.
Yeah.
I'm doing a lot of work in Guyana. Guyana is a country which until last year had a GDP of about $3 billion. It has recoverable resources in oil, recently discovered and recently producing, of 9 billion barrels. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's one of the poorest countries in Latin America, and this is basically their only opportunity. And it's also, you could say, it is a country that has really been quite abused historically in terms of its natural resources. 45% of its population are ex-slaves. Another 45% of its population are ex-indentured servants from India. Yeah. And now it has this amazing situation where it could be per capita, and you're talking about per capita 800,000 inhabitants of what is actually quite a large country. It could be per capita the richest petroleum state in the world.
Yeah.
Well, my question is how does the ESG balance the obvious carbon problems? No one's saying to them, listen, we will pay you to keep that oil in the ground. ExxonMobil is certainly saying this is kind of the cheapest discoveries we're going to have. Yeah. So the government has every intention of taking everything out of the ground, but it also has intentions of educating the people, providing them with healthcare, providing them with infrastructure, providing them with a completely different quality of life. So I'm very interested in just hearing your opinions on how an ESG system should deal with this, what seems to me like an enormous conflict between dirty oil polluting our environment and oil revenues completely changing the life of the population of an entire country. So that's a horrible and difficult question to start with.
Thank you, Miles. I really appreciate it.
I thought.
No, so I think there's a couple of things to say there. So, with regards to oil and gas isn't going away, but I think what's going to happen with ESG is that there'll be a lot more costs. So environmental costs will be internalized a lot more. So people will look at the carbon intensity. They'll say, how expensive is it to get, and how carbon intensive to get this stuff out of the ground? Is what people look at. So some of the most efficient producers will likely benefit from that. But then I think there's other things that, and you just hit upon them. If you are a third party, say as you said, ExxonMobil as an example, there will be a focus on what you are doing from a social program perspective to make sure that the wealth that is actually going back into that community. What are you doing from a governance perspective to make sure there's transparency around the revenues and how you are paying people? So this isn't a new problem. This happens in lots of places. It happens with mining, and it may happen in Africa. It's like, the point is that there should be transparency about who you're paying for what. Clearly there's an issue around things like bribes in this kind of situation as well. And I think that the difference is today than there was in the past is that a lot more of this stuff will be tracked and will be transparent. And I think that companies that try and get around this will be punished. So you may be a third party, E&P company that's working in Guyana and you'll be listed somewhere, and you will get a lot of questions about, okay, this is a great find, but okay, what's the carbon intensity of getting this stuff out of the ground? What are you doing with regards to social programs to make sure that this benefits the wider community? Oh, and by the way, are you being transparent about all the payments you're making? And I think in the past, companies kind of got away with a lot of that stuff without having to really report it. I think that the difference is now they won't, and if they are found to be lacking, the difference will be people will not invest in them. So I think that when it comes to oil and gas, there are still lots of investors that will invest in oil and gas, but this is one of the kind of core factors they will apply. They'll say, okay, you're a low cost producer, but are you also doing all these other things? Because they'll have a lot to choose from, especially in this kind of environment where you've got a relatively low oil price. And so if you're not hitting, not hitting best practices from an ESG perspective, I think people won't invest in you. And I think there is a view from that community, the oil and gas community, that they are under a lot more scrutiny than used to. But I think this also applies to mining as another example. So I think there is a lot more scrutiny in this area, and I think it's not just about whether ESG funds will invest in you. Clearly, it's not really about that. ESG funds aren't really looking at oil and gas. It's whether a regular fund, when it's doing its ESG overlay of this investment, says, oh, there are too many things about this I don't like, even though this is a great find. There are too many things here that raise a red flag from an ESG perspective. Therefore, I won't invest in you, even though you've actually found a good, on the face of it, resource opportunity.
I think that's a very good answer, Chris. I think these things are much more nuanced than what we hear in the press, and the mining of lithium, which is vital to batteries, is there's a variance across a lot of different companies and territories as to how contaminative that might potentially be. And I think in oil and gas, if you can completely change the economy of a country, the people who just say keep it in the ground need to come up with some scheme whereby they pay to keep it in the ground. Because
I think that yeah, I think that's right. And I think but I would say I think most people have got their eyes open that oil and gas is not going away. There may be reduced use of it, and if there's going to be reduced use of it, then the most efficient producers are likely to win out. But then you need to internalize the other costs, and so those are social, environmental, and governance costs. So, obviously for a country like Guyana, it's not going to be great if that wealth just accrues to a very small part of the population, which is happening in some other countries.
Indeed, you're right, and that's mainly due to corruption. But let us not go into that.
But I think there's a lot. No, but there's a lot more focus upon that than when it comes to investing in a particular equity. And like, oh, you're operating in the high-risk jurisdiction when it comes to corruption. What is your transparency like with regards to that, as an example? So those questions are getting asked a lot more.
I think this is what makes the whole ESG platform much more interesting, because it's actually about transparency rather than being judgmental. Yeah.
So the origins of this was when we first saw these things, it would be a negative screen. It would be, okay, a pension fund would say, well, I'm going to invest in only, or have the benchmark, it'll have to be, FTSE all share minus fossil fuels, so I just won't invest in fossil fuels. Whereas I think there's just so much more nuance about it now. I'll look at each individual company. I may invest in an oil and gas company, but I'll look at their ESG factors and say, I'm going to invest in an oil and gas company, but it'll be one that is the best performer from an ESG perspective.
Perfect. Very good answer, mate. I'm going to go and speak to my wife and celebrate our anniversary.
give her a kiss from me then.
I will do.
Hey guys, you just did an excellent dialogue that inspires me to schedule a panel in the future with both of you on this particular subject. There's just a lot to understand and to discuss around this topic. But let me introduce Armando Nuricumbo. He's going to be moderating the Q&A, and we have a list of very interesting questions, and we have some in the chat. So please, Armando, welcome to our conference. Yeah.
Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Chris, for being with us tonight. It's really a privilege to pick up your brains on such an interesting topic. And I would like to ask you a little bit of, let's say, from a philosophical standpoint, how do you see the relationship between corporate social responsibility and these ESG criteria or ESG standard? No, is that probably the let's say the grandfather of ESG? Now I remember 10, 15 years ago, all the companies were worried about corporate social responsibility, starting with transparency exercises, voluntary reporting on certain issues.
Yeah.
But from your perspective, what's the relationship? Do they coexist today, or we're going to forget about corporate social responsibility in the future and just focus on ESG?
Well, I think that they're inextricably linked. They become the same thing. I think they were separate. I think at the start, corporate social responsibility was more of a PR exercise. I think some companies did really buy into it, but the thing was, it wasn't something that investors were particularly focused on. I think now, as I said before, I think when we talk about ESG, a lot of it started with environmental, and I think it's got a lot broader than that. And so there's just corporate social responsibility and ESG are now inextricably linked, because you can look at the E, you can look at things like how your carbon footprint, but then you look at social, it's things like am I treating my workers well, which is a clear corporate social responsibility thing. It's like, how do I deal with unions and these kind of things now, and then when it comes to governance, it's like senior management diversity. Do I have a strong independent board? There's all these things now that have come together. I think the difference between now and then is companies were kind of doing this on their own. But now we've got to a stage where there are, information providers like FTSE Russell, which is obviously owned by us, which are trying to standardize the information that corporates put out so investors can compare across all of these different companies and say, I understand what they're doing from an environmental, social, and governance perspective. Oh, and by the way, these are the various categories that we could look at to analyze these companies, by the way, which are different depending on the sector. So it's quite complex. But what I would say is that this has become something that's become a lot more systematic and structured than it used to be. So corporate social responsibility was a great thing in the past, but now I think actually it has become something which is part of the investment decision-making process for an investor, especially from the kind of the social aspect of that kind of part of ESG.
All right, thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's very interesting. So picking up a little bit on that question, is there any methodology, any standard, for example, an ISO standard that could be followed for compliance of the ESG principles, or are we still on a stage where kind of every company is having its own interpretation of how to get there, but there's no clear pathway, a clear standard, global standard, which I would imagine would be very difficult for all the different markets to accept one specific standard?
Well, I mean, the thing is, actually, there are lots, so I said FTSE Russell probably do this for about 14,000 companies globally, which is a lot of companies. So the UK probably has, I don't know, 2,500 listed companies. So 14,000 is a lot more than the UK. But I need to be honest, FTSE Russell is not the only person who does this. You've got MSCI who's doing this kind of thing. You've probably got S&P, and you've probably got people like Sustainalytics. There are different people that are doing certification of green bonds. So the problem you've got is that there are standards, but they are not a global harmonized standard. So what we've been trying to do, and I think I put this in the presentation, we're working with investors and governments and supranational, multinational kind of entities to try and come up with kind of harmonious standards. Now, clearly, what do we want? We want investors to track our green indices, and we want the most people to see us as being the standard. I think that there will be, I don't think there'll be one standard, but what I think there'll be convergence between the various standards, because actually what you would see now is if you went into one particular company and looked at their ESG score, and if for the largest companies, you probably have quite a few providers who are providing, there's actually quite a lot of divergence. I think that investors will demand that the providers of this information kind of coalesce around more standards. So at the moment, you may say, oh, my MSCI sustainability score is 20, but my FTSE one is 47%. That's a big difference. How is that possible? Well, it's because they place different emphasis on different factors. So what aspect investors and issuers will do, as well as, we're part of these standard setting bodies, is lead to a closer alignment between the information providers. So there is more comparability between the different providers of those kind of disclosure scores.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. Actually, we have a question here from David Godiner from the group. Would there be interest or a mechanism from the London Stock Exchange to finance small projects, probably less than $15 million US, but that are sustainable projects in Latin America? We're talking about electromobility, distributed generation, perhaps through a special purpose entity owned by a major company. Is there anything specific that LSE could offer? But my guess is that we will have to develop the vehicle for this investment locally and then try to do the listing directly in the exchange. No, I don't think the exchange by itself would provide a vehicle or a mechanism.
No, I mean, what we would do is we provide the venue for you to list that particular vehicle, but clearly we get a lot of companies that are looking to finance specific greener sustainable projects, and they'll do project-based financing, and that may be through an SPV, and that SPV can issue bonds, and those can be listed in London. Sometimes they may be backed, or they may have some guarantee from, say, a development bank who are very anxious to help with these things. So that could be or it could be an export credit agency, for instance, if they're, for instance, in Mexico, and, the UK government does as an example, say that there's a project in Mexico, and then there is a UK manufacturing company that's providing equipment for that particular project. The UK export credit, kind of financing agency may provide some support, and then there can be bonds that are listed with that support in London. So there are various things that you can do. We don't go out and find the investors, though. That's what investment banks do. But we provide the venue.
Chris, maybe I can butt in there. I mean, this is what my bank specialises in emerging markets, and we certainly can start with that as long as there is a plan to grow this into a bigger project. On the AIM market, it is entirely possible to start off with a $10 million fundraising. And, plus we work with UKEF, we work with the development banks, So we can provide the step up, but it has to be for a company that is going to be validated, or its business model will be validated over the long term to have the capacity to turn into something much larger. So
Yeah.
you can start quite small on the AIM market. You can easily start at $10 million. But
Okay, so it
only
looks like David has to call Miles. No?
Yeah,
quite possibly.
call Miles.
No, excellent. I mean, this is what it's all about.
Only if there is a business, but only if there is a business plan that means in 3 years' time we're going to be looking at raising $30-40 million a year, and this is going to be a company that's worth hundreds of million dollars. The AIM market is designed to facilitate companies that can grow quickly. So we can start small, but the AIM market, the difference between the AIM market and a lot of the other small cap markets in the world is the AIM market is almost entirely institutional money. So if you can't convince them that this is going to be a big company in 3 years' time, then they are not going to be interested. Yeah. If you say this is the opportunity, we need to start with a small amount of money, but next year this is the prospect, and the year after this is the prospect, then absolutely we will back you.
Okay. Okay. No, sounds very good. Thank you, Miles, for the comment. Yeah.
Do you think that's fair, Chris?
No, I think that is fair. I mean, I think it depends on the project, but no, I think you're right. And then I'd say if you wanted to do debt issuance, then that tends to be something that's certainly a bond issuance would tend to be larger than kind of equity finance projects. Then that's probably what Miles is focused on right now.
Absolutely. Right. I mean, bond issues you can't do until you have a balance sheet, until you have a big bunch of assets. Yeah, but you can, if you have a sensible business plan, do equity issues, even for relatively small amounts.
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent, excellent, Miles. Thank you for the comment. So again, David, you need to get the telephone number of Miles and give him a call. I'm sure Rodrigo can put you guys in touch.
Absolutely. Okay. Very happy to chat.
Excellent. Chris, another question that we have is perhaps you could dig deeper into this a green economy mark, which I read as the designation that you get once you comply with certain requirements to have this designation. 2 questions on that. What kind of obligations does this create for the issuer? Is there any legal financial obligation, or is it mainly transparency related? That would be the first question.
Yeah, so it shouldn't be seen as obligation. It should be seen as a mark of success, actually. So just to give an example, though, of where this can be useful. So there was a business owned by KKR called Callison that IPO'd in London in January or February. Now, they make smart meters for electricity and things like that. Now, before they IPO'd, they came to the exchange and FTSE Russell and said, we know that you've, released this green economy mark. We're going to show you our financials. Can we get the green economy mark before we IPO? So when we do the roadshow, we can tell investors we're going to have the green economy mark. And that's what they did. And that was a very successful IPO. When they went on their roadshow, they said, oh, by the way, we've got more than 50% of our revenues from the green economy. And they were making a big thing about that to investors, and you know, that was seen as a selling point to investors. So there's no charge for this, by the way. There's no cost. There's no and you know, the companies should be just doing this as part of their ordinary reporting, and FTSE Russell can look at their ordinary reporting and say, yes, you qualify. Now, the only thing I would say is, if you start to generate, say you're a green economy mark company, and then you buy a coal mine, you probably end up with less than 50% of your revenues from the green economy, and you will lose the green economy mark. So that's the only way I could see it as being something that is negative in the future. But it should, in most cases, be something that's positive, and it doesn't impose any obligation on you at all.
Okay. Are there any rules in terms of if you apply for it and you don't get it, you need to wait for a certain number of fiscal years to? No, it's pretty flexible also. Yeah. Yeah,
and what I would say is that it's not really almost a case of applying for it. What is happening, certainly for the London listed market, for FTSE Russell is looking at AIM, it's looking at main market premium, and it's also looking at the specialist fund segment where we have investment funds listed which are focused on renewables and things like that. It's actually looking at those companies and saying, oh, you qualify. By the way, do you know you qualify? We want to give it to you. So it's not like they have to come to us. I mean, Callison did because they were a private company, so we didn't have the data. So they came to us and said, we know that you do this. Look at our data and tell us if we'll qualify. This is the data in the prospectus. And FTSE said, yes, you'll qualify, and you can say that you will get it if you are listed. And so they used that as a marketing point during the roadshow. But for other companies that are already listed, we give it to them really without them asking for it. But they see it as a positive.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Chris. And the other question I wanted to make about this is, in your opinion, how solid is really the link between not only green economy mark, on not only the London Stock Exchange, but in general, companies that comply with ESG around the world, and let's say the actual financial benefit for them on that, you know, whether it be higher valuations, higher PE ratios. Is there information that can really solidly link a premium from the investors to this type of companies, or being honest, not really, because also, you know, investors, you have a premium from investors not only from this but from many other different topics, like especially the financial performance of the company. How robust is this link, these studies that have been made trying to link social ESG, corporate social responsibility, with better financial performance over time?
Well, I think that I understand the point of your question. I'd say that it's something that's hard to measure perfectly, but going forward, it should be easy to measure. Now, what I would say is that in the past, the evidence is mostly anecdotal, so you can point to specific situations where a company has done something usually badly from an ESG perspective, and that has had a significant impact on their share price. Now, I can think of a specific situation this year in the UK for a company which is, let's say it's I don't want to say the name of the company, but this is in the public domain, but I don't want to be too negative about them. It's an e-commerce company, and there was a lot of negative press about how much they were paying employees, and whether they were actually being paid minimum wage or not, and if their working conditions were satisfactory. Now, that report got a lot of play in the media, and there was a precipitous fall in the share price of that company. So that shows you the impact that this can have. But for the most part, where we are today is that, and I can think about corruption scandals. I can think about BP and the Gulf of Mexico as an example. The oil kind of spill they had, which went on for months and cost them billions of dollars. Obviously, for those things, you can directly link it. Exxon to Exxon Valdez kind of thing. So lots of these negative examples, which are anecdotal. I think going forward, when you have better information about companies that you can show, and it's granular, that you can show to investors, in the future, you'll be able to do much better analysis across all kinds of companies, benchmarking them against each other and looking at share price performance, especially within sectors where companies should be similar. I think that's where you'll get to. I don't think we're there yet, though.
No, and it's very interesting that you raised the point about labor issues, because I think especially labor issues is a little bit like moral issues, where the morale of 40 years ago not necessarily is the morale of today, and will not be the moral values of maybe 30 years. In Mexico today, we have a big discussion about outsourcing, and it's been there. It's been there for a long time. There are many companies that use it for tax avoidance. That's a fact. But also there's a lot of companies that use it from a rational perspective, because they don't need to have the permanent resources there all the time. So there's a big part of the outsourcing that is also legal and without any problem. But now today, the president of Mexico doesn't like outsourcing and is pushing to get legislation to practically outlaw it from the country. And from that perspective, also, how do you see this evolution of labor and the future of work, and how that may impact also the ESG field in the future? We see it also in California with all these Uber workers that are not permanent employees. Doesn't make sense that they are permanent, but there's a big debate if they should be employees, or in reality they are part of this gig economy where everybody's free to work. This labor issue is changing all over the place, no?
Yeah, it is, and I think so the focus has been, when you talk about outsourcing, it has been, say if you are a clothing manufacturer and you're based in a developed market, but then you make your clothes in, I don't know, topic somewhere, Southeast Asia, that the standards that the employees are obviously not going to be, say, European standards, but the standards are good from a local, at least from a local living standard. That I think there are lots of NGOs that are going to track that kind of thing. And I think what companies will do, though, is they will start to be proactive and say, I'm going to let third parties monitor what's going on. So at least I can turn around to my investors and say, the working conditions for these, they're getting paid above, at or above what local, things would be. They're getting, good working conditions. They're not working too long hours, and have third parties actually report on that. And there are quite a lot of risk management firms that are looking at providing that data, to be able to track that kind of information. About what you're talking about goes further, which is, should you even be offshoring those jobs in the first place? Which I think at the moment is more of a political issue. That there's a question, where does the moral, where does the moral issue kind of intersect with the financial issue? Now, I think the view at the moment is, if you're treating those employees well, even if they're in a developing country, that's okay. But maybe you're right. There may be issues in, say, the US or Mexico, where they'll try and legislate to say, there is a penalty for you moving jobs abroad. So I think that's more probably a political issue than it is an ESG issue right now. But I think the core ESG issue is, are you treating workers fairly given the environment they're used to in that local jurisdiction? And I think that companies will bring in third parties to monitor that, to kind of let the outside world know that they're treating their workers fairly.
Sure.
If I can interject,
Sure.
I think one does need to address directly the gig economy, because the gig economy effectively relies on, government subsidizing the employees of these companies. So I'm very interested to know what the ratings of food delivery companies, Uber-like companies, all these gig economies that say They don't have permanent employees. And by the way, I think it was yesterday, Rule 22 or whatever it's called, passed in the States, saying, no, it's fine. These are independent contractors. But I think ESG, to be credible, has to be very, very clear about this.
Yeah, but I would say, Miles, I think this is an area where I don't think the governments have actually got their act together, in that they're trying to impose imperfect labour laws in a situation where actually they need to create something specific for this new category, which is somewhat of a hybrid and which shares the cost between government and so should Uber be able, for instance, to provide subsidised healthcare to its contractors? Well, yeah, of course. I mean, that seems like a good idea, but people are also forgetting some. And I go a lot in Ubers around the country in the US, well, I used to before COVID, and in lots of places I met people who actually had other jobs and they were using this to top up their kind of employment. Or it was a soccer mom and it was the middle of the day, the kids were at school, and she was just using it to top up her income. So it's not as clear cut as people think. But I agree with the point. But also, I would also say is there are jobs here where you can literally say, I'm going to work for you and I'm going to work for your competitor at the same time. And also, I'm going to take tomorrow off and not tell you. So it's a lot less simple than just saying, oh, these people don't have access to benefits, because there are other things that make this more flexible. So there needs to be a hybrid provision of some kind of labor regulation safety net. It's in between contractor and full-time employee, and at the moment there's not a good solution to it.
Totally understand that. All I'm saying is that it needs to be incorporated in the ESG model in order that these companies don't float on as a kind of this is a fine thing.
Yeah, no, I agree. From a social perspective, what you want. Yeah, I mean, certainly in the US, from a social perspective, healthcare is a big issue, and a lot of people will take an underpaying job in order just to have access to health insurance, which is a perverse situation. Now, obviously, with Uber, you don't get that. So, from a kind of social kind of perspective, as I said, if Uber was able to provide subsidies using its market power, not full health insurance, but subsidies to its drivers, then it is doing something to help them from a social perspective. Because if you're an Uber driver, and that's all you do, you don't have, you can look at Obamacare as an example, but you clearly have an issue from a healthcare perspective. And so if they wanted to bridge that gap, that would be a tick in the social box of ESG, so to speak.
All right.
Right. Well, we're running out of time, so we probably have only time for one or two more questions. Perhaps Chris and Miles, feel free to give your opinion on this, because I think it's an interesting point. I really believe that also the value of ESG is that probably the private sector will figure out some of these very complex issues like labor probably sooner than governments, because maybe the companies are closer to really what's happening in reality. And to me, one example is, for example, climate change, especially today when you hear certain leaders of the world either denying climate change or saying that it's not important, and when it's one of the biggest issues and threats of our time. And I think at least with this kind of regulations, with this kind of standards, at least the private sector and the companies will be, a voice that will be heard, trying to defend and take action on climate change. Unfortunately, many of these issues get too political, and then they are used for political purposes. But I think ESG at least will be something that will provide a true discussion on the real issues on certain of these topics, you know, like labor or corruption or climate change or corporate governance.
Well, I mean, I think that what we're trying to do is from a private sector's perspective. Well, I would say on climate change, I think there's been a lot of international cooperation on this. Unfortunately, there has been some issues from certainly in the US with wanting to break away from that kind of consensus. But I think certainly in Europe and certainly from an LSE perspective, we think that having better information and having targets to reduce carbon intensity is something that is not going to go away. It's something that's going to accelerate. And so we just want to make sure that the best information is out there and that investors can make their decisions on the basis of that. And what I would say is that the money that's going into those investments, so from the general public, certainly in places in Europe, they want to see that those investors are investing in investments with lower carbon intensity. People in the US may not care, but certainly I think in Europe they do. And so there is going to be demand for that specific kind of product. And as I showed in the presentation, the amount of money that's being allocated to responsible investments is increasing and has been a lot less volatile than regular equity kind of inflows or outflows. But you're right. I mean, if the US isn't going to be part of this standard setting, that does kind of create a conundrum. But I think the feeling in Europe is that this is something that's here to stay and isn't going to be reversed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would be horrible if all of a sudden you got some business leaders also saying, yeah, we agree with certain presidents, climate change is not an issue, and let's forget about all this. I think these kind of standards make that, at least for public companies, very, very difficult for the private sector to take that stance. But with issues that become so political, I think it's crazy that we even have to discuss if it's an issue or not.
Yeah.
But yes, I don't know if anybody has any other questions here in the chat, or if they want to propose any other topics. If not, perhaps I would invite Jesus just to close the participation, to close the session. And again, Chris, giving you big thanks from Mexico City for participating with us. Hopefully, and maybe next year when things go back to normal, we can meet for a nice lunch or dinner with Miles also here in Mexico City. Jesus will pay that dinner. He has already told me that he will invite.
Absolutely, yes.
Cool.
Thank you, Chris. It's been a pleasure having you here and getting deeper into this new concept of funding and investment. I think that the London Stock Exchange is creating a best practice in this, and that should be replicated in the world pretty soon.
Yeah.
For this so-called responsible investment. So thank you very much. You are an honorary member of the NEA, so you are welcome to participate in any of our weekly conferences, and I'm sure pretty soon we're going to be calling you for another interesting presentation.
Cool. Look forward to it.
Yeah. With a full support of Miles. If not, we won't be doing that.
Yeah, with his whiskey.
Oh yes.
I've run out of whiskey, but I do know Jesus is taking us to La Docena to eat the best crab legs and clams in the world. So I'm very happy about that.
No,
yes, sure. Well, I will ask.
Just an idea. Just an idea.
Yeah.
If we invite Chris again, we'll invite the head of the Mexican Stock Exchange. We can have, and now we have 2 exchanges.
Yeah.
So now we can have Maria Arisa, that maybe from the new exchange.
I do know.
Yeah.
Well, that would be a nice
we're close friends of those guys and the lady. So yes, that's visible.
By the way,
Sure.
FTSE Russell provides index products to Beaver.
Yeah, I know.
So we have
there's a close relation.
we have a business relationship. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And
That's just an
I'm
idea.
talking to a number of Mexican companies about doing dual listings, because obviously the London market, especially in natural resources at the moment, has a much deeper institutional client base. And there are a number of Mexican companies that could benefit from raising capital, especially in the mining sector.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We'll see those opportunities
Excellent.
very soon. Okay, so I'm asking all of you, the attendants who still are here, to turn on your mics and your cameras. So to give a big applause to Chris for his presentation. As a tradition we usually have when doing these conferences. So thank you very much, and we applaud you.
And we'll send tequila.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
And
Thank you, Chris.
we hope to see you soon, Chris.
Yeah, thanks a lot,
Miles,
guys.
thank you very much for joining us. And y a todos los demás, muchas gracias por estar con nosotros. Ha sido un tema muy interesante. Ya les estaremos enviando la presentación y los links de los que nos habló Chris. Muchas gracias a todos. Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
Chao.